Hello, and welcome to today's webinar. I hope you will join me in welcoming our host, Josh Blander, who is currently Assistant Professor of Philosophy at the King's College in New York City. He completed his PhD in philosophy at the University of California, Los Angeles, after earning an MA in philosophy at Biola University and BA in political science at the University of Pennsylvania. Prior to teaching at King's, he was a fellow in medieval philosophy at Georgetown University. His primary areas of research are in late medieval philosophy, contemporary metaphysics. He's also currently investigating pedagogical models of philosophical inquiry that promote Christian character formation. Blander and his wife also homeschool their 2 children through Classical Conversations curriculum. And with that, I will throw things over to our host.
Hi, everyone. It's very exciting to be with you on this webinar. I'm humbled to speak to so many heroic homeschool parents and students. I see the work that my wife does every day while I'm here at the college. And I'm so excited about what I see in my own children, in the communities that they participate in the growth that they experience, both in their minds and in their character. And that's part of what I want to talk about today, is why classical education can play such an important role in our culture today. Just want to add to this, that the parents out there, you make my job as a professor so simple when you send along your students to places like this. You send students who are our best and brightest students. They're eager to learn, they're filled with promise and joy, they allow us to speak into their lives, and they're receptive to learning. What you do in preparing their hearts and minds is at the heart of education, at the heart of the best pedagogy that we can offer. It's such a valuable feature of the homeschool model and the classical education model. We couldn't do what we do as professors at a college like this unless you had worked so hard in shaping your children's lives. And if your children weren't responsive to that, it would be a challenge for us as well. And so I do want to talk about the value of classical education today. More significantly, I want to talk about why it matters right now in this cultural moment. And perhaps in ways beyond what some of you have considered. Now, there are obvious values that most of us share, and why we think carefully about the model of education we have, a classical model. For example, we know that it helps students form a wide-ranging understanding about important ideas. We also know that it prepares people to enter every walk of life through careful and systematic cultivation of the intellect. And I think many of us, when we hear classical education, those are the kinds of things that we focus on. We focus on various academic excellences, and rightly so, because it's set apart from other types of education that emphasize vocational preparation or immediate skill acquisition or information transfer. And those are, of course, useful, but they should not define our pedagogical vision, because our culture's vocational needs change over time, and that demands that we acquire different skills and that we learn new information as our lives unfold. And that kind of adaptation occurs best if we train people how to examine new ideas that they have never encountered before, or that they understand material quickly when it's presented to them. And that we encourage reasoning and writing abilities that apply across nearly every field of inquiry and vocation. And these are some of the capacities that classical education best develops. But the deepest insights available to classically educated students are not vocational. Classical education aims at wisdom about how to live the best kind of life, the best kind of human life, what it means to be human, how to live as a human being among other human beings. We could talk about this in more familiar terms, I think. Classical education, especially when it's begun in homeschool communities, encourages students to consider what kind of people they should be, or better, what kind of character they should have. Furthermore, the books they read, the ideas and arguments they discuss and examine, and the love and the encouragement of their parents, their friends, their professors when they get to college, form habits of mind and heart that produce good character. In other words, this special form of education helps students to form character-shaping and character-defining virtues. And those are crucial for living in society, living in a culture. And I'll add that the formation of character is, I will argue, the defining issue of our time, and it's the most urgent. Because of the way in which classical education can play a role in the formation of character, it seems to offer the best way to address the urgency for the need for character and the cultural ills that we face by not paying attention to character. So why is this so important? Unless you don't read the news at all, you've read and heard of continual battles between people of opposing political ideologies, vitriolic speech, tasteless mocking, cruel jesting, along with disdainful moralizing toward one's opponents. We reject their beliefs, their belief systems, their ideas, and the people themselves. We also continue to hear report after report of grotesque abuses of power, often in order to satisfy sexual desire, disordered sexual desire. We even witness the resurgence of neo-Nazism in Europe and racial strife here in America. Now, many popular and academic talks take up these problems and suggest solutions, and even the popular press addresses these matters as well. Often, we focus on training seminars. This was the answer that Starbucks offered to the challenges faced in the Philadelphia Starbucks last year when two black gentlemen were asked to leave simply because the person who was at the counter, or the manager, didn't feel comfortable with them being there. And yet they were doing perfectly legitimate things, working on a business plan in the Starbucks. But training seminars are not the obvious way to address problems of race and racial strife. Another way that people speak into these issues is to encourage us towards civility or tolerance. But the issue runs much deeper than this. If we examine the nature of character in our own world throughout the 20th century and into the 21st century, we see lots of cases in which we didn't think that character played a big role, but we see that it does. If we think about the Holocaust, you think about all the events of World War II and how Germany treated Jews during the Holocaust. This was a horrendous evil. But notice, Germany was not alone in its poor treatment of Jews. Throughout Europe, the attitudes toward Jews were overwhelmingly negative. And though most countries didn't have policies that were quite as wicked as Germany did, culturally, Germany wasn't that different from a lot of other places in Europe, and especially Eastern Europe. And we might think, well, okay, but that was then. This is now. We hear, it's 2019. We don't hold those views anymore. Well, that's what people right after World War II said. Those were the Europeans. That was the Germans. We're not like that. Well, a psychologist named Stanley Milgram ran some experiments at Yale after World War II. And what puzzled him as he set up these experiments was the thought that so many German people who otherwise seemed like good, hardworking people were complicit or even played an active role in the Nazi regime. And he wondered how people could do such things? Why would so many people be willing to be involved in such heinous atrocities? And when he ran his experiments, he had in mind the idea that, we can see whether authority encourages people to do things that perhaps they otherwise wouldn't do. When he ran his experiments, what he discovered was that most people were willing to inflict pain and even torture on other people, as long as someone in a white lab coat, someone who seemed to be an authority, suggested that it was okay. The experiment was set up so that there were people in a room with a button that they could press, and they were told that the button controlled shocks that could be delivered to a person who is wired up to a machine that would deliver a certain level of electrical voltage to another person. And they were encouraged, when they gave the shock, to consider what they heard, whether they heard screaming, and then they were instructed quite often to say, okay, now let's turn it up. We're trying to test the tolerance these people have for pain. And they kept turning it up, and they would hear horrible screams from the other room. But if the person in the white lab coat told them to turn up the voltage, the person turned it up more often than not. Now, what does this suggest to us? It suggests that many of us, perhaps not all of us, but many of us are willing to do things under certain conditions if we think that it's acceptable, whether it's culturally acceptable, acceptable to the authorities, people that we trust, and in this case, people in white lab coats, scientists, doctors. Now, no one was actually hooked up to the voltage machines. No one was being shocked. But every single person in control of the zaps believed that they were hurting another person with the voltage strikes, because they could hear these screams, and they didn't know that there was no one connected to those. And yet they continued to do these things. There are plenty of other experiments that have confirmed and reconfirmed these results. This was not an anomalous discovery. And this, along with many other cases, are discussed in a variety of books, one of which is by a philosopher named Christian Miller, who wrote a book called The Character Gap, and he addresses many of these concerns about the nature of character and why we should attend to it. But again, when we look at our own cultural landscape, we can recognize the demand, the need for the shaping of character, for formation. And when we think about training seminars as a source of eradicating racism, we wonder, will that do it? And actually, there's literature available that suggests, or studies have been done that suggest training seminars sometimes have a reverse effect, that people become more resistant to the things they want people to learn through such seminars. The seminars don't change our hearts. They don't change our desires. Well, what about the suggestion that we need to be more civil or tolerant? Well, how do we become civil or tolerant if we've never done it before, and if we haven't practiced it? Our culture generally lacks the language of character formation for thinking about how to become civil, how to become tolerant. These aren't the sorts of virtues that we can simply choose, that we can just decide one day, I'm going to be civil and tolerant today. They require good parenting. They require good education. They require training and habits that are cultivated over time. Furthermore, the call to civility and tolerance is perhaps overdone. Sometimes anger and incivility are appropriate. We should be angry at the level of injustice that we saw in the Holocaust, in the killing fields, in many other places around the world. We should be angered by these things, and we should not suffer through them just for the sake of being civil. And most importantly, I fear that the calls, the admonitions towards civility and tolerance are aimed too much or aimed solely at the public good, with little attention given to actual human beings. Even our educational models focus on public civil goods, right? Get an education so you can become a good citizen, be a productive member of society, contribute to our societal well-being. These all aim at contributing to broad societal or public goods. They don't mention very often the goods of the individual person, the person's character, or the smaller communities in which we exist, which is unfortunate because in individuals and in the communities where we learn and grow, whether that be our families, our homeschool communities, our towns, our neighborhoods, those are where our character is formed. There's little mention in these broader claims about how we can become good. The focus is on how we can avoid disrupting the public good, even if we remain terrible human beings. So by leaving our own character untouched, we risk failing to promote the very engine of public order, the engine of public good, of public well-being. And that's that the individuals in the polis, in our cities, in our neighborhoods, themselves must be good if we want goodness to inhabit our entire community, entire culture. This is an idea that we find abundantly in Plato's Republic. If you look at Book 4 in particular, you find Plato's discussion of the good city and the good soul. We think of that book as political, and perhaps that is a reasonable emphasis. But we all should notice that Plato challenges us to think about what the rightly ordered soul looks like. And the reason for that is that we will not have good cities if we do not have good people inhabiting those cities. So he says, we need to think about how our souls or how our lives should be ordered. What role does reason or the intellect play? What role do our desires play? What role does the animated part of our souls play? What kinds of people should we be? Well, that's in part determined by how the parts of the soul, again, my mind and my stomach, my feelings, my desires, my emotions, how those relate to one another. If they're disordered, if I'm ruled by my desires, by my stomach, then I'm probably going to be in trouble. So how are we going to order our lives? How are we going to order our souls? That's the crucial question for us. And it's when we take that question seriously that we can begin to think about how to have well-ordered cities, well-ordered public life, how we can then influence culture. We can make a culture better by ourselves being better. This is, again, where classical education has an advantage over other models, because classical education takes seriously the basic features of the formation of the intellect. But in every piece of literature that you'll read that focuses on the classical education, you can't miss the emphasis on the heart or on the desires, on cultivating those and transforming us, being transformed by that education. We also find this kind of discussion regularly in Augustine. Augustine, as a medievalist, Augustine is one of the people who inspires me the most in my own thinking. I do mostly work on later medieval thought, but Augustine has influenced the way that I teach probably more than anyone else that I've read, other than what I see in the teaching of Jesus throughout the Gospels. Augustine distinguishes in multiple places between temporal laws and eternal laws, or the city of man and the city of God. One of his points in making that distinction is that government cannot settle all matters of justice. If we're thinking about whether killing is appropriate, for example, we can't ask whether or not killing by itself is good or bad. Sometimes, at least for most of us, we think that sometimes killing is good, but most of the time it's wrong, flat out wrong. Now, what are some of those cases where we're at least tempted to think that it's acceptable? Perhaps self-defense, perhaps in war. At the very least, we recognize that there might be a case in those situations, whereas wanton killing of people for no reason, of murder and so on, those are clearly wrong. They're wrong in every situation. But we don't think that we can read the intentions of people. And we ought to be concerned if a government suggests that we should start to evaluate the intentions of people. Some of you may know various movies that address these sorts of things, or books like 1984, or a more recent movie like Minority Report, tries to read the intentions of people in order to anticipate crimes and prevent them from happening before they can even occur. But this requires that we think that the intentions should be things for which we put people in jail or prosecute them. But think about the person who has a desire to harm someone, but repents of it. Should that person, because of the original desire or intention, should be put in jail? Or do we think that there's something that's been morally redeemed in that process? All of this is to point out the challenge of the suggestion that the government can execute justice perfectly. So then where do we create justice, or how do we create justice in a city or a society? Well, again, I'll appeal to Plato and also Augustine. For both of them, justice is the right order of the parts of the soul, or the parts of the human life, the parts of the human being, the intellect, the desires, and the spirited part of us that animates doing things. And Augustine offers an innovation. He also offers the will. And the will has to be rightly ordered along with these other features of the human person. Without that, we don't have justice. So justice simply is that proper ordering of the human soul. And when we translate that to the city or political life, it's when we have a rightly ordered city. So justice then should be about having a rightly ordered city, but it doesn't seem like the government is able to bring about justice in the soul. That seems like a different endeavor entirely. So then where can we develop justice in the soul? It happens in the way that we educate, and it happens in the way that we raise our children. We encourage them through habits. We encourage them through the things we have them read and learn and discuss to become the right kinds of people. So we're training their intellects, but we're also training their hearts. We're training their minds, but we're also training their desires. Augustine actually addresses many of these questions in his book, The Confessions, which is arguably the greatest book ever written solely by a human being. And at the very least, it's the greatest autobiography or memoir ever written. Throughout that book, he addresses the need for the cultivation of both the intellect and the emotions and the will. All of these things need to be shaped and ordered. We see Augustine throughout wrestling with philosophical ideas. He's wrestling with what he should believe. But when he gets to book 7 and he recognizes, I'm convinced that Christianity is true, that my Manichaean beliefs are false, that I shouldn't be an academic skeptic. After he's run through all of these philosophical pictures and he arrives at one that he believes, he's still stuck. He still isn't able to convince himself to fully commit to this life as a Christian. There's a passage in which he asks God to remove his sexual desires, but then he says, "But not yet." Right? This points out the role that desires and our wills have in governing our lives. He recognizes that he needs to change his wanton ways, but he's not willing to do it quite yet. And so that requires this process of habituation and transformation in our souls. In his soul, it required a great deal of work. Intellectual conviction was not sufficient to bring about the changes that he knew he should undergo. His desires had to be transformed, and his will had to be transformed. He mentions in this process of telling his autobiography, his story, that his parents, especially his father, focused on intellectual achievement in his education. As long as he had a prominent position, and he was trained as a rhetorician, as long as he had a prominent teaching position and was getting excellent education, they weren't worried about anything else. And again, this was particularly his father, though his mother, Monica, also was tempted to these thoughts. What they were concerned with was fame, power, influence, status, in all the typical ways that we think about those kinds of issues. And Augustine says, the intellectual achievement is valuable, but if my heart remains the same, then it's all for naught. If I can't live in accordance with the things that I've come to believe, then I've fallen short. I've missed something. And so he recognizes that the desire to aim for fame and power and influence or status were misguided. Those were all features of pride. What he needed to do was become unconcerned with power or status, fame, influence, fortune, and become concerned with loving what's good, loving the highest goods, found fundamentally in God, found in the virtues of justice, temperance, fortitude, and things of that nature. And of course, along the way, one of the things that he recognizes is that he cannot do this himself. We live in a fallen world. Our wills have been damaged by us. And so finding a way to gain better conditions for our will became really important to him. But as much as he exerted his will, he found that he couldn't simply will the right things. His will was not strong enough to do what he wanted to will. This points out his concern that in order to live well, in order to will well, to desire well, to have the ordering of all of the parts of the human life that entails justice, we need divine grace. Divine grace enables us to see, to understand, as well as to do. It enables us to know, and it enables us to will. So how do we conduct ourselves in this way? How do we find our way in classical education to engage in this kind of character that Plato and Augustine are encouraging us to take seriously? Well, I don't have a lot of specific, detailed, practical tips, but I will say that the model of education that we find in the classical tradition and in homeschooling communities is our best hope for the formation of character. None of these issues are new issues. Sexual desire, as I've just pointed out, was something that affected Augustine. It's not just a new thing. The political concerns that we find today, the competing ideologies and the anger and the vitriol that we spew in discussing them, none of this is new either. In fact, the past is filled with times when people weren't allowed to be angry with one another. Dissent was silenced. But what can we do? Parents, homeschool parents, you have this incredible role because you can influence your children, both as your children through your parenting and as students through your educating. You are their teachers as well as their parents. You're in the best position to encourage the formation of character. Through the model as a parent, showing them the kinds of things that people do in public life, the way that you relate to your friends, to the people in your churches, in your neighborhoods, in your governing boards of Little League, Rotary, whatever you're involved in. And through the ways that you encourage your children to live, even when those depart from the roles of parents. We encourage habits in our children. And what you teach and how you teach affects your children. The fact that you play both roles, you play the teacher role and the parent role, gives you this powerful ability to transform the character that your children have and to shape them into the kinds of people who can live well, who can love well, who can be angry well, who can be just in their souls. And if we prepare them with just souls, we can then send them out to engage the world around them, around us, to help it be more civil when it needs to be civil, to stand up for justice when we need to stand up for justice. And of course, when I talk about justice, I'll just briefly mention the word justice in Plato is dikaiosune, the Greek term. That's the same term that in various forms appears in Paul's letters, but we translate that as righteousness. So all of the things I said about training for justice, what we're really talking about is training in righteousness, becoming righteous people, becoming just people. That's our goal. We want to learn to be righteous, and we want our children even more so to be the kinds of righteous people that can shape our culture in the ways that it needs, not in the ways that some might want. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. If any of our attendees have any questions, you can go ahead and type them in the chat box, and we'll get to as many as we can. So what aspects, like if parent were going to start providing a classical education with their homeschooler, where would be an easy place for them to start?
I mean, of course, it would depend on the age, but if you're talking about very young children, I think, and this is not a requirement, but I think we're best suited to engage in this in community, to learn from others, so that if I'm not a homeschooler but I want to become one, then I look to others to give me guidance. So we have joined a community called Classical Conversations. Many of you may be familiar with that. There are other homeschool communities around the country. This is, again, the one that was in our area. And we've flourished in our education as a result, because we get ideas for curriculum, we get ideas for how much work we should expect our children to do each day, and it provides a support network so that when you have those days where you feel like you're not successfully educating your children, others can come alongside and say, yes, there will be days like that, but just watch what happens over time. Listen to the way they speak and listen to the things they care about, and you will see, at least most of the time, those changes. So I think finding a community is the best place to start, because it gives you that encouragement and the wide range of resources that people who have been doing these things already can help you with. And of course, I don't know how curated the co-op is, but my wife and I looked at that the other night as we were thinking about my preparation for this, and there are lots of resources available there as well, and information about the kinds of things to look for. But classical education really should focus, to talk a bit about nuts and bolts, on the basics that's, especially with young children, that they need to learn. They need to learn how to write. They need to learn how to read. They need to learn basic math. Reading, writing, arithmetic, that hasn't changed. Those are still the foundations of education.
Thank you. And what, as a parent who's using this technique to school your children, what have you found to be the most rewarding aspects of this?
Wow. Well, let me brag about my children.
Please.
I think, yeah, I think watching the kinds of interests they have, seeing them get excited about learning. I will brag briefly about my daughter, at least. She's done, in classical conversations, they have a process of memory work so that you can become what's called a memory master. My daughter's done it 3 years in a row, which I think is the farthest you can go without doing all 3 years as a combined thing. And, just watching her learn things, seeing what she learns, seeing the things she knows. My wife and I marvel, and we say, I don't know that. So the love of knowledge, the love of understanding and learning. I've been reading the Lord of the Rings to them at night, and they're just enamored of it. They just can't stop. Every night they're disappointed when I say, okay, it's time to go to bed, and we stop reading. So that voracious desire, right, that is unquenchable to learn more, has really been something that we've cultivated in them, and they've responded exactly as we would have hoped.
Thank you. We have a wonderful question from one of our attendees. I find that classical education, in its pursuit of the traditional great books and resources, fails to engage the contributions that diverse people groups have made to the study of good, virtue, and justice. How can parents of classically educated children ensure that their kids know that their value and truth is diverse in perspective?
Well, I think, once again, finding a community that can offer resources and insight on how to engage a diverse range of topics. And of course, we can mean a lot of different things by diversity. I found, for example, that in my own concerns are that sometimes logic and philosophy are overlooked in classical education. So there can be a lack of diversity in that way. There can be geographic or cultural or racial diversity that we can add as well. And again, I think the key is to rely on knowledge communities, right? Relying on people who can give us insight into what books are most valuable, and finding churches and other communities that don't just look like we do. Finding places where we have old and young in the same community, where we have people of different races working in the same community. That's the way in which we can nurture and encourage an interest in finding the ways in which righteousness and justice are discussed across many different cultures or across many different projects that people have engaged in.
Thank you so much. Well, that brings us to our time for today. So I hope you will all thank or join me in thanking Dr. Blander as well as the King's College New York City for joining us today and sharing your wisdom and advice on classic education. This was a really fascinating topic, and we absolutely appreciate you. And thank you to all of our attendees. It's always wonderful to have you join us for our webinars at the Co-op. Have a great day.